It seems to me there are 6 mistakes, contradictions, myths that have crept into our thinking about nuclear weapons. And each of them was made by a different group at different times, but together they work to make the entire field convoluted and confused. The notion that nuclear weapons create a revolution in war has to do with the fact that in the past, if you wanted to defend your country, you put your army between your enemy and what you valued, your cities or your populace or whatever. And as long as your army was standing, you were safe. But people say, as a commonplace, nuclear weapons invalidate that because you can now fire a missile over the army, you don't have to defeat the army, and you can destroy the cities. And this is, in fact, a conceptual confusion. What you're doing is you're confusing nuclear weapons, which are a particular kind of phenomenon, with missiles, which is something else altogether. And missiles are what creates the revolution, not nuclear weapons. And to understand this, you have to think of a world in which there are no nuclear weapons, but there are still missiles. In such a world, it would still be possible to fire missiles over the army and attack the city of your opponent without first defeating his army. It would take more missiles. You'd have to use conventional warheads. It would be more expensive, but it would still be possible. And the only way to defend against such an attack or to stop such an attack would be to threaten retaliation, that is, to deter. Now imagine the opposite world in which there are nuclear weapons but no missiles, or perhaps the nuclear weapons are so large that they don't fit on missiles. Maybe they're the size of a boxcar. Then you would have to put them on large ships and sail them into coastal cities, or put them on semi-tractor trailer trucks and drive them through the enemy's line. But in such a world, it would only be necessary to defend. You could build walls at your borders to keep the large trucks out. Deterrence wouldn't be necessary. The second is the notion that nuclear war equals apocalypse. And this is a popular mistake that began in the late 50s, early 60s. The problem with this is that apocalypse is really a religious idea across cultures and religions. There is, of course, the book of Daniel in the Jewish Bible is apocalyptic, and Revelation in the Christian Bible, and there are apocalyptic surahs in the Quran, and the Zoroastrian religion has a thing about the end of time. The world will come to an end with the end of time. But it's a peculiar thing to try to understand a 21st century concept, a phenomenon like nuclear war, with a 3,000-year-old myth. It seems to me that what we've done is we've taken a familiar myth, the myth of apocalypse, something that is horrifying, but at some level we're comfortable with, and taken that familiar thing and put it over top of the new event that makes us uncomfortable and that we're unfamiliar with. It's not until we look directly at nuclear war and understand it for what it is that we'll be able to understand nuclear weapons and the implications they have for warfare. The third point is Hiroshima. And Hiroshima really is at the heart of everything we think about nuclear weapons. It's the crucial first impression we get of them. And the traditional interpretation is that 2 nuclear weapons won the war, forced the Japanese to surrender, and the emperor goes ahead and goes on radio and says, we have to surrender now because of nuclear weapons. So what could be more obvious than that? And as a result of that, Stimson writes an article in Harper's Magazine in 1946 that says nuclear weapons have a unique ability to shock and overawe opponents, and it becomes the conventional wisdom about nuclear weapons. Except there are a whole series, if you examine the facts more closely, and in the last 20 years, historians have been looking at the facts and in archives in Japan and Russia and the US. And if you look at the facts more closely, a peculiar thing happens, because none of them seem to line up with the notion that Hiroshima is the cause of the Japanese surrender. And it's only when you let go of that notion, which we all have been told, and walk around and look at the facts from over here with the idea that it's the Soviet declaration of war on August 9th and the invasion of Manchuria and Sakhalin Island and other territories that forces the Japanese to surrender, that suddenly all the facts make sense. Everything lines up. It really is a paradigm shift where suddenly you see the facts in a new light and they make sense. People talk about the H-bomb revolution. It's commonly said among historians that, you know, the first bomb, the Hiroshima bomb, which is a fission bomb that breaks atoms apart, and then you get the fusion bomb in '52, fuses atoms together, the H-bomb. And it's generally seen as a quantum leap in the power and the destructiveness and therefore the decisiveness of nuclear weapons. But there's a peculiar thing about hydrogen bombs. Initially, you can build hydrogen bombs as large as you like. There's no theoretical limit to the size. But starting in the middle 50s, the size of the bombs gets, the size of the warhead, the explosion that the bomb makes, gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And today the bombs are really not much larger than the Hiroshima bomb, the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. And the physicist Freeman Dyson, who is at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and is part of JASON, which is a secret group of scientists that study futuristic weapons for the US government, has said that even if the H-bomb had never been invented or discovered, it would still be possible to have the exact arsenal that the United States has today because of improvements in fission bombs and because of this constant reduction in size. The reduction in size is a problem. It's a conceptual problem. It doesn't make sense. Nuclear weapons are important because they make big explosions. And if that's so, why is it that you wouldn't build the biggest explosion that you could? Each increase in size would be an increase in the importance of the bomb, in its power, in its political impact. And yet, military planners have consistently said, we want smaller and smaller explosions. Now, obviously, in part this is because in the late 60s, early 70s, they wanted to put multiple warheads on rockets, and so they needed to make them smaller. But even since we've gone back to just having one warhead per rocket, we don't have an increase in the size. And that should be a warning flag to us, because nuclear weapons, their central characteristic is their bigness. And yet here we seem to be struggling against that, which is peculiar. So let's talk about nuclear deterrence. We treat nuclear deterrence, we talk about it as if it were something solid, real, certain, something that you could find on a table and pick up and turn around and it would be in 3 dimensions. But in fact, there's very little solid evidence that supports its existence or the notion that it works. Consider, much of nuclear deterrence rests on the notion that you can threaten people by attacking cities and that they'll be coerced. And it's intuitive, it seems intuitively obvious that if a nation threatened to bomb London with a nuclear weapon, that Great Britain would necessarily capitulate to whatever the demand was, because in peacetime, the idea of a city being destroyed is horrifying, and should be. It's horrifying in all times. But if you look at the evidence of war, what you find is that threats to destroy cities and actually destroying cities almost never cause countries to surrender. I'm not sure why that is, but it is so based on the historical record. The United States bombed 68 Japanese cities in the summer of 1945. One of the reasons why it's improbable that Hiroshima caused them to surrender is that if they were going to surrender because of Hiroshima, why didn't they surrender because of any of the other 67 cities that were bombed? The destruction at Hiroshima was fearsome, but not that much greater than many of the attacks. And in some cases, it was less. More civilians were killed in the bombing of Tokyo than were killed at Hiroshima, according to the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. So, although it makes sense to us that, in theory, deterrence, nuclear deterrence, ought to work, we all fear the notion of a city being attacked, the evidence from history throws doubt on that notion. And the question is, if you're going to rely on nuclear weapons for the safety and security of your nation, for the well-being of your civilians, shouldn't you have more than just an intuitive feeling, a speculation, a sense that it must be so? Shouldn't there be some sort of hard evidence that shows that this ephemeral thing that we seem to be relying on, nuclear deterrence, actually works? There's been peace in Europe for 65 years, and so nuclear weapons must work. Nuclear deterrence must keep the peace. But this is a proof by absence, a notoriously difficult form of logical proof to prove. The notion that nuclear weapons keep the peace in Europe is true, absolutely, as long as there's only one possible cause for peace in Europe, and that's nuclear deterrence. If any other possible cause exists, then the proof fails. So that if you have interconnected businesses and economic relations that keep the peace, or if you have stronger cultural ties as a result of television and jet travel and so on, if you have strong international organizations like NATO and the UN and the European Union. The other thing is that there are just periods of peace in history. Europe knew substantial peace from 1815 to 1848, 33 years, when nuclear weapons played no role in European history. The ancient Egyptians had 200 years of uninterrupted peace. So yes, it's remarkable that we've had peace for 60 years, and we should be grateful. Does that prove that catastrophic war is gone forever, or that nuclear deterrence ensures that we can live in peace in perpetuity? I don't think that's proved. So what? What are the implications of these 6 contradictions and confusions? What do they mean? It seems to me that we know one thing for sure about nuclear weapons, and that's that they are enormously dangerous. For a long time, we felt that they were useful. They were militarily and politically useful, and so their usefulness outweighed the dangers, and so we had to keep them. And I think where we are now is that since Kissinger and Shultz and President Obama's speech, there's now a kind of sense that the dangerousness is here and the usefulness is here, and that's why we're on a very slow path towards abolition in 100 or 150 years. For 60 years, we've had this deadlocked conversation in which it was kind of a battle between idealists and realists, and the realists always won. But I think this new conversation about usefulness is one that we've never had. And so the possibility is that there is a very real prospect of getting rid of nuclear weapons. Not because we're idealists, but because we are hard-headed realists, and that we understand that they are much less useful than we originally thought, and still as dangerous as we've always believed. And so that is an important, that is a pragmatic, sensible, prudent reason for getting rid of nuclear weapons.